Hello and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. I'm delighted that Nick Brana is joining us tonight to discuss the growing opposition to NATO and the need for a political alternative to the mainstream parties on both sides of the Atlantic. Nick's the national chair of the People's Party in the US, and he's also leading the Rage Against the War Machine in the States too. In 2016, Nick was the national political outreach coordinator for Bernie Sanders. The night before the No to NATO rally in London, I was on a Twitter space discussion with Nick talking about the threat posed by NATO. Nick then took an overnight flight from Washington, D.C. to join us at the No to NATO rally the following morning, where he made an absolutely brilliant and inspiring speech. So I hope you've recovered from your travels, Nick. Welcome to the show this evening.
It's great to see you again, Chris. No to NATO was a fantastic event. I'm so glad that I came over, and I'm so excited for what comes next.
Well, it's great. We're really pleased to have you there. And I know you went down a storm with everybody. And I think a lot of people were amazed to know that we were on a discussion. You were in the States just, less than 24 hours before, 12 hours before probably. And there you emerged and made this brilliant speech, having been up all night. So I just wanted to know, Nick, I mean, a lot of people will have heard of the Rage Against the War Machine, but I guess quite a few people watching will not be overly familiar with the campaign and what you've been doing and how it's been going. So I wonder whether you might just sort of give us a bit of background to the Rage Against the War Machine, when it started, how's it going? I know you had a rally the week before we had the No to NATO rally. So if you could just maybe set the scene for us with that to start with.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Our Rage Against the War Machine protest here in the United States, we did something really unprecedented. It was an enormous success. On February 19th, we got together with the People's Party and the Libertarian Party, along with Action for Assange, many other organizations, about almost a couple dozen. And we rallied at the Lincoln Memorial. We brought together 3,000 to 5,000 people. It was an incredible event, the largest protest against the war machine, certainly since the war in Ukraine escalated over the past year, and also even since the Iraq War, in fact, in 2007. And so it was an incredible success. Our march stretched several blocks to the White House. We held another rally there with additional speakers there. It was huge, and the reverberations have been felt throughout the establishment, the kind of DC, war machine establishment. We were immediately attacked twice by two different hosts and anchors at MSNBC, Joy Ann Reid and Rachel Maddow, who did ridiculous smear pieces. Of course, the next day also, Joe Biden actually went to Ukraine and reaffirmed the United States' endless blank check commitment to the war and nuclear brinksmanship. And so we've felt the kind of repercussions of what we've started. It's really reinvigorated and revived the anti-war movement in the United States, and we have a lot of plans going forward.
Well, it's really encouraging to see that, and what you've been doing over there, I think, has helped to inspire our campaign here as well. And I was delighted when we were able to make that connection with the Rage Against the War Machine, and the fact that we're building a transatlantic opposition to NATO, I think is very significant. And obviously, as we've spoken about, you and I and others, the potential to build a No to NATO campaign throughout all the NATO countries in the world. And we know that there is a lot of opposition in other NATO countries. In fact, on the weekend that we were meeting, and the weekend before then you were meeting, when these rallies, this opposition that we were outlining was replicated in many countries across Europe, wasn't it? I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of those.
It was incredible. While we were meeting that weekend, on that anniversary of the war, the 9th, there was 50,000 people came out in Berlin in opposition to the war, led by Sarah Wagenknecht, who took the same approach that we did in the United States of bringing together people across the political spectrum from left to right to oppose the war. It was really groundbreaking in the U.S. It was great to see it happen also in Germany, and I know it's really shaken the political establishment over there. especially
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, it's certainly cause for hope, and we need to sort of build those links that we've done between the UK and the US with these, excuse me, with these other nations. I understand, Nick, that there's going to be a vote today in the House of Representatives, a Syria War Powers resolution, which would require, if it was passed, I understand, Biden to withdraw all the US troops from Syria. I mean, has the vote happened yet? And what do you think the likely outcome is going to be if it does?
There is. It's happening later today. It's scheduled to begin in an hour or two, and the Biden already claimed that U.S. troops were withdrawn from all of Syria. U.S. troops are occupying a third of Syria. The third, of course, with the greatest amount of natural resources, the breadbasket and the oil of the country, and so there's this resolution proposed by Matt Gaetz to finally remove the troops because it's an illegal occupation, even according to U.S. law, let alone international law, that American troops are there, about 900 American troops. And so we expect that the resolution, hopefully it will succeed. I think that its prospects are not that good, though. But it was endorsed by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Thankfully, they're finally doing something because they proposed a similar amendment in the last Congress. So we'll see how it turns out in just an hour or two.
I saw as well. I'm not sure when it was, whether it was how recent it was, but there was a People's Party tweet about Biden telling China not to send weapons to Ukraine whilst he's flooding Ukraine with US weapons, and also sending substantial sums in terms of weapons to Taiwan as well, and sort of threatening the Chinese mainland and encouraging Taiwan to essentially formally secede from China. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, it's kind of astonishing, isn't it?
I mean, the hubris is unbelievable that the U.S. is telling China not to provide weapons to Russia and for its side of the war in Ukraine when there's $115 billion worth of military aid and aid that has been provided, $60 billion worth of which is weapons from the United States to Ukraine, let alone all the other NATO countries. And the United States is simultaneously providing $1 billion to Taiwan, trying to stoke another nuclear war with another nuclear superpower, and trying to give it $1 billion in weapons and encouraging it to secede. I mean, the comparison that I made previously was as if China would go to the Pacific. They would surround Hawaii and military bases and warships. They would give it $1 billion of Chinese weapons and then try to stoke a secessionist movement and get them to break off the mainland. The United States would nuke China if that happened. And yet the U.S. is there in the South China Sea declaring every part of the world is our hegemonic dominion of control. It's truly insane.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps you could just say a word about the Monroe Doctrine, which I think you were kind of alluding to there when you said that if China did what the US is doing and NATO is doing, that the US would nuke China. I mean, just say a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, that's part of the great tragedy of and irony of the United States is that the United States had its revolutionary beginnings in rejecting British colonialism and breaking off from the crown in 1776. And then, within about, almost immediately, because it was conquering territory to the west that, was a part of Mexico or Canada or Spain or France, and of course the indigenous peoples of all of the Americas. But the Monroe Doctrine essentially is still the operating principle of the United States, except it's been expanded to the entire world. The Monroe Doctrine stated that the Western Hemisphere was essentially the United States' sole zone of influence, and it wouldn't tolerate other colonial powers in Europe, meddling essentially in Latin America or the Caribbean. And it's kind of amazing that, of course, that's not applied or extended to any of the other major powers in the world, be it China or Russia, and that shouldn't exist, of course, for any country. And so, it's still very much the operating principle of U.S. foreign policy, and it's gone beyond the Monroe Doctrine. Now it's a Monroe Doctrine of global hegemonic control.
And yet the propaganda that's pumped out by the corporate media, certainly in this country, and I think it's the same in the United States as well, is that it's countries like China and Russia that are the aggressor, that they are the real threats to world peace. I know if you look at the historical record, it completely flies in the face of that. But a lot of people seem to buy into this propaganda, don't they?
They do, unfortunately, because the media is all corporate controlled, and the media corporations, when you look at them, in the United States, there's 6 major corporations that control 90% of the media. And just to take MSNBC for an example, the media corporations themselves, MSNBC is a subsidiary of General Electric. General Electric also makes bombs. They also make military gear. And so, of course, that just gives the corporation, General Electric, the parent corporation, a massive incentive to have their propaganda wing, MSNBC, just reporting in favor of more war over and over, because it's just acting as the PR agency of the corporation. So, that's why you always have the mainstream media cheering in lockstep with the duopoly in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, and the rest of the military industrial contracting companies, which are all merged together and owned by the same banks and owned by the same parent corporations.
But the independent media's making a fight back, aren't they? And certainly in this country, we've got some independent platforms which are getting quite a lot of traction. Obviously, we want to build it up more. We're one of the very small ones that you're speaking with us on tonight. But people like Jimmy Dore has got a huge following, and incredibly charismatic and inspirational figure. I think somebody who's had a real life. He's not like a normal, if I can put it in those terms, politician who has, most of them, in my experience, often from very sort of privileged background and don't live in the real world. But people like Jimmy, of course, come from a working class background, done a real job, and has had real difficulties in his life with back problems, health difficulties associated with that, and not being properly insured, etc. And so he's a great spokesperson, I think, for ordinary working class Americans, and has got a big following, hasn't he? I mean, I know he does lots of video shows, lots of podcasts, but also he's kind of on a relentless sort of tour around the country and doing his live stand-up shows. I mean, how influential are the independent platforms, and how many of them are there over in the States, Nick? I mean, are they sort of on your page? Are they supporting, the progressive, what you're trying to do in terms of the third party over there?
Well, one of the things that brings us together is an opposition to war, and so that's really helped rally the independent platforms to support Rage Against the War Machine and opposition to NATO and the war in general. And their independent media has really emerged in the last 8 or so years here in the United States. Following, of course, the advent of the internet, social media, it's created an entirely different kind of political landscape. The ramifications of that are still reverberating. It still hasn't settled. It's still very much reverberating across society. The Bernie Sanders campaign, where I was the national political outreach coordinator in 2016, it was a product of the internet. It would not have been possible. It was very close to a political revolution in the United States. Bernie Sanders should have gone independent at the end, run as an independent, and broken the two-party system. He refused to do it. That was his fault. We're where we are because of his decision. But the fundraising was small dollar crowdsourced fundraising. The organizing was, through the internet. The media was through social media and independent media. So that campaign wouldn't have been possible And now, 7 years down the road from that in 2023, independent media has developed tremendously. There's, of course, a huge backlash from big tech that is trying to deplatform and censor in coordination with the Pentagon and the security state, all these independent platforms, but they haven't been able to contain it. And so the kind of influence of independent media has grown very substantially. For example, Joe Rogan, who's the biggest podcaster in the world, he gets 11 million downloads per episode.
Wow.
That's more than the biggest mainstream media TV news show, for example. Tucker Carlson, he gets about 3 million views a night. And he himself is the only mainstream media kind of news anchor that will actually oppose the war. He promoted Rage Against the War Machine. He'll talk about other anti-establishment issues. But CNN and MSNBC, in a country of 330 million people, they only get about 1 million or 1.5 million nightly viewers, their programs. And so, people talk about the influence of the mainstream media. It's significant, but it's also way overstated. And the independent media is catching up to it, if not surpassing it in some places.
Yeah. I know when Bernie was running in 2016, that coincided with Jeremy Corbyn coming to the leadership of the Labour Party, and there was a lot of hope there. I mean, Jeremy won the leadership in 2015. We had a really good result in the 2017 general election. Didn't quite get over the line, but secured the biggest increase in vote share since 1945 for the Labour Party, with a radical programme, a modest socialist. I mean, I think it could have gone further, but it was a modest socialist programme on the domestic front, but an anti-imperialist foreign policy. I think that was the thing that really frightened the horses more than anything. And I was looking forward to a meaningful special relationship with Bernie in the White House and Jeremy in number 10. But unfortunately, all our hopes were dashed. And like you say, we are where we are now. But I mean, I just talking on the issue of the anti-war theme still. I mean, what we're finding in this country are that there isn't. I mean, well, Jeremy, to be fair to him, is Jeremy Corbyn still speaking out, for against war and using his political platform in that way. I think it could be maybe stronger in some of his commentary that he's making, rather than a sort of, the kind of playing on both your houses and sort of almost saying that the Russian military operation and they're always almost as responsible as NATO. And I think when you look at the record, that's not the case. I mean, nobody wants war, but this war could have easily been avoided. But what we're finding though, so Jeremy's that one voice, but he's not in the Labour Party. Well, he's in the Labour Party, but he's not a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. The weird state of affairs. He's a Labour member of the Labour Party, but he's not got the Labour whip, so he's not officially a Labour MP. But there are no Labour MPs and no other MP from any other parties that I've seen speaking out for peace, speaking out against war. And we're also finding that a number of the trade unions, the trade union leadership, are similarly banging the pro-war drums. It's almost like a repeat of what happened in this country in the First World War. I just wondered, Nick, what's the situation in the States with regard to the Labour movement in general? What's the Labour movement's position in terms of war and NATO in general?
Well, this is a connection that I'm glad you're drawing, because few people in the U.S. labor movement, especially in the leadership, do make that connection. At the end of the Second World War, the United States had about 35% unionization of the workforce, and it's declined since then to about 10%. And in the private sector, it's only about 6%. And so the labor movement was a once mighty force in the United States during the Depression, coming, in the 40s and the 50s. But what happened is that the labor movement started, first of all, it associated itself with the Democrat Party, and it, and it followed the Democrat Party wherever it went. And as the security state metastasized, which also happened during that same time period from the end of World War II to the present, the power of the labor movement has declined sharply, to the point where today they really, there is beginning to be finally a resurgence in the labor movement, but they don't really threaten the Democrat Party. They don't really threaten the war machine. And that's what needs to happen, is that there's too much what's called business unionism here, which is the leadership of the Labor Party just, works with those in the Democrat Party and does whatever they want. What they need to do is they need to break out. They need to help form a major new party in the United States that 71% of Americans want. And they need to stop going along with whatever it is that, the Democrat Party tells them to do. The labor movement back at its height in the 40s and 50s and during the Depression, it used to fight for those policies that supported and uplifted the entire working class. They fought for a 40-hour work week. They fought to end child labor. These things that benefited everybody. Today, the labor movement has been so beaten down that they're just kind of focused on their own individual contract negotiations. They no longer have this kind of working class consciousness, and they no longer fight for those things that would benefit the working class as a whole. And as a result, they don't inspire the membership, and they don't provide the leadership to the working class that they used to.
Yeah. I mean, a similar picture in Britain, unfortunately, maybe not quite as bad as that. I mean, the membership, trade union membership is substantially higher than that, but it's much lower than it was in its heyday in the 1970s. And there isn't enough, I don't think, here either, emphasis on that raising of political consciousness. There has been a retreat into just kind of that narrow sort of focus which is not unimportant. But I think without that kind of political consciousness raising, we're never going to sort of change the systems that then, obviates the need for some of the struggles that the trade unions are having to get involved in. And of course, many people who are the most vulnerable workers they're not organised, they're not in trade unions. So, they're being ruthlessly exploited. I mean, precarious employment in Britain is endemic throughout the land. I mean, millions of people are struggling on very low wages, and they've got very high rental costs. That public housing has been decimated in this country, and it looks like there are similar difficulties that you're encountering over there. But so, with that said, then in terms of the labour movement, and obviously you've established with others the People's Party, and I think you just said that 71% of US citizens support the notion of an alternative party emerging to challenge the corporate parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Interestingly, that's reflected in a similar poll that was undertaken recently. Actually, I think only last week, a poll was reported that suggested that 2 out of 3 British people would like to see a new party emerge to take on not just the government, but to take on the Labour Party as well. The question is, can the left in Britain galvanise the forces that are out there that are engaged in politics but maybe ploughing a very narrow furrow to come together? That's certainly what we're looking to do. That's why the Socialist Labour Party and the Workers' Party got together to try and push this no to NATO, no to war agenda. And I think that sets the trend, which I hope others will follow, of the need for collaboration. But what's the situation in the States, Nick, in terms of, obviously, the People's Party has been established now. It's certainly getting some traction from what I can gather. Is it likely that the People's Party could potentially pick up that support that there is out there for this third party to emerge, to take on the Republicans and the Democrats?
I think it very well could. I think that as the People's Party, very much like Jimmy Dore, we are embodying this political realignment that's happening in the country. And that is that there's an increasing recognition that, well, first of all, the two parties don't represent us, the Democrats and Republicans. They're parties, anti-worker, permanent war parties, but also that the way that we're going to be able to fight back effectively over here is that by uniting along class lines. This is a class war between the working class, 99.9% of the public against a tiny number of elites that hold all of the money and all of the power, that control. They've bought off Washington. They run the wars. those are the people, they control the financial system, they run the global oligarchy, you know, from Wall Street. And so those are that is the reorientation in American politics that's taking place. It's becoming increasingly clear to people on the left and the right that corporations are not our friends, especially when you're talking about big pharma, you're talking about the big mainstream media, you're talking about big health insurance corporations. Back in the 60s, the kind of movement that was anti-corporate, that was very critical of corporate power, was virtually exclusively on the left. But nowadays, through things like vaccine mandates and the mainstream media hostility to people on the right, especially the populist right, there's an increasing recognition on the right, as there is on the left, that these big corporations do not represent kind of our interests and, run amok. They just squash working people. And so, there are the forces out there on the left and the right and across the political spectrum in the US to be able to unite that, but what we need now is to be able to have a kind of vehicle that enables to do that. One of the things that could do that in the US could be a very galvanizing presidential campaign that brings together the left and the right, that kind of embodies this emerging, zeitgeist and spirit in the US of fight back, that unites people as working class people, as Americans, against the oligarchy. So that could happen. And that's one of the things that we're working on as the People's Party.
Because, you've got other obstacles, I think, which we don't face in this country, to do with ballot access, as I understand it. Could you just explain that for our viewers? Because I think a lot of people will be quite astonished to discover the obstacles that you've had to overcome in order to be able to even put up a candidate in the first place in presidential elections and state elections and so on.
It's a nightmare. Richard Winger, the #1 ballot access expert in the United States, regularly quoted in the mainstream media, he talks about how the US has ballot access practices and ballot access restrictions and barriers that you don't see anywhere else except for, dictatorships, essentially. So in the United States, you have to collect about 1 million signatures to get a presidential candidate on the ballot. And then beyond that, you have to follow specific regulations that are very granular and, extremely burdensome and difficult and expensive in every single state. So our ballot access process isn't national. Every single state has its own process, and you have to get on the ballot in every single state individually. And that requires getting, tens of thousands of signatures in, every state. Sometimes you have to get a certain number of signatures in every congressional district within that state. Other times there's other barriers that you have to follow. For example, they narrow the window of time that you have to get ballot access. They make it very, just a few weeks. Okay. In New York, for example, you have just a few weeks to collect like 60,000 signatures now. And so it's just crazy. All of the different, they keep adding hoops and restrictions and other things, to make it more and more burdensome. They just keep manipulating the law, because the truth is that the two-party system in the United States is a completely artificial construct that is propped up by legal infrastructure of horrendous ballot access laws and other financial barriers. And if you were to take that away, it would collapse in an instant. The two parties would cease to exist because nobody supports them anymore. And so I think that, though, as the People's Party, we believe that the public disgust with the two parties and with the policies they enforce of, endless war and oligarchy are now so unpopular that you have that 71% record number of people who want a major new party. You have half the country who identifies as independent. And so that disgust has reached a level where it can overpower the barriers, especially now that we have the help of the internet. Ralph Nader in 2000, his run, when he ran with the Green Party, he got only 2 minutes of mainstream media coverage, 2 minutes. Now we have our own platforms that can get the message out. and the media has to cover us.
Yeah, no, indeed, absolutely. And let's just hope that you can get a galvanizing candidate to run. Is there any prospects of someone coming to the fore, do you think, that will pick up the cudgels and run? There could be
Well,
that
Jimmy's the
galvanizing
first
figure.
person that comes to mind. Like you said, Jimmy would be a fantastic candidate. That's, it's yeah, only he and his wife Steph can make that decision, of course. There are other people who would be good, I think, who would be great, and so we'll see. It's not something that one of the dynamics, Chris, that I'm sure you're aware of is that the best people are often people who they don't want it. They don't seek
No.
it. And that's part of what makes them the best is that they're not driven by ambition or careerism
Yeah.
or money or fame. They're driven by principle, like Jimmy is. And so
Yeah.
those people, often they're not attracted to the idea of doing something like this to their credit, and if they did it, it would only be for the right reasons. It would be because they could break the two-party system, they could break the political system, and they could help millions of people in the process. And so, it's someone like that, and someone who has, a substantial platform and following and integrity, who could potentially unite people across the country in really bringing down this two-party system.
I mean, that was one of the attractions of Jeremy, of course, when Jeremy stood for the leadership of the Labour Party. He wasn't seeking it, and he had to be persuaded to do it, really, and he was very reluctant. And I think people did rally to that. It was like a breath of fresh air. And then, and he was talking about socialism again, and there was this massive appetite for the agenda that he was articulating. And we hoped then. I mean, I'd been a member of the Labour Party. Well, before I ended up being suspended, which we haven't got time to go into tonight on spurious grounds, I was Jeremy's biggest cheerleader in the House of Commons when I was an MP. But we hoped then that with the mass support that we got in terms of mass membership, actually, and mass support for the policies, and there's overwhelming support for the policy agenda, if you could get a hearing for it. But the mainstream media tried to divert people onto other topics that, Jeremy was a Czech spy or he was a misogynist. There's lots of ridiculous things. And the one that got traction because of Jeremy's response to it, actually, was when they was accusing him of anti-Semitism and the party being riddled with anti-Semites. Ironically, some of the people that were first targeted were themselves Jewish, actually, but they were prominent pro-Palestinian campaigners and prominent supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. But we hoped that we could use the Labour Party as a vehicle to really make transformative change in the country, much more so even than that 1945 to 51 Labour government that did many, many good things, but could have gone a lot further, in my opinion. You've set up, I mean, in a similar way, there are kind of parallels here, because I've given up. The Labour Party is a lost cause. I mean, I believe our duty now is to try and kill the Labour Party and try and build this alternative vehicle, whatever form that will take. But I think it's absolutely desperately needed. I mean, are there people in the States saying that the focus should be on trying to reform the Democrats, or have people now come to the realization with the Bernie Sanders experience that the Democrats, like the Labour Party, are incapable of being reformed into becoming a genuine vehicle to actually promote class interests? I mean, working class interests, not the ruling class interests, what they seem to be doing at the moment.
The Democrat Party is probably the least popular party in the United States.
Yeah.
Because it is the party, the Republican Party is the party that kind of, openly disregards, worker rights and, increased wages and things like that. And the Democrat Party, though, is the one that it was historically rooted, at least since FDR in the 1930s and the Great Depression, in being more progressive and in supporting, labor rights, supporting higher wages, supporting social programs. And yet, and with Clinton in the 1990s, Clinton basically repealed the New Deal, FDR's New Deal, and did away with all of that. Also did away with the financial protections that had been put in place by FDR after the Great Depression and the collapse in 1929 in the U.S. And so, that's why we had the Great Recession. And so the Democrats repealed their own social programs, their own program. And so that's why they're so unpopular, is because they claim to believe something different from the Republicans. They claim to feel that urgency that working people feel in this country, and yet they act in the complete opposite way. And in reality, they just do whatever their donors want. They're completely captured by Wall Street. And so that's why there is such an opportunity. There is no authentic party, major party on the left here in the United States, but there is an opportunity to form one. And so that is what we're working on. It's very interesting to hear that the same thing is happening in the UK. The two parties definitely need to be broken up here in the U.S., and the Democrat Party needs to be the first one.
Yeah, well, more power to your elbow then on that, Nick. I mean, just finally then, one of the things that I think certainly over the last 30 years or so in this country, which has hampered, I think, the development of a kind of class consciousness, and that's kind of identity politics, really. I mean, the Labour Party, in the past, historically, had always been seen as a working class party, and had championed the interests of the working class. It always had that trade union link, as it were. But for a long time now, I mean, certainly so-called New Labour under Tony Blair, they put a lot of, all the emphasis really to demonstrate their progressive credentials, if you like, was around identity politics. But during the 13 years that Labour was in government, although that government did do some decent things, they did a lot of bad things, of course. The Iraq War being one of the worst, of course. But inequality got considerably worse. Poverty was still massively widespread throughout the whole country. The anti-trade union legislation. In fact, Tony Blair used to crow about the fact that there was some modest tinkering with the anti-trade union legislation that Margaret Thatcher's Tories brought in, and the Labour Party, under his leadership, yielded, I think, to some pressure from the trade unions to repeal some of it. But then he went on to say, this was prior to the election, that even after a Labour government comes to power and makes these reforms, Britain will still have the most restrictive trade union legislation anywhere in the Western world, as if that was a good thing. Is identity politics a major difficulty for developing an alternative platform in the States, Nick, or is that something that people are beginning to recognize, that if you don't have a class consciousness, if you don't put into practice class politics, then everything else is really going to pale by comparison?
I think that's beginning to happen, because identity politics has been an incredibly pernicious weapon of the establishment. It's really divisiveness and a kind of a distraction or a cloak to economic populism that masks itself in a progressive veneer. And so it pretends to speak in the language of inclusion and diversity, but in reality, what it's doing is acting as it's really dividing the working class and preventing them from coming together along class lines to overthrow the oligarchs. And that's really what needs to happen. There is kind of there's finally a backlash happening in the United States against identity politics and the idea that we need to, define ourselves first and foremost, not as human beings, who all have share similar needs for good health care, good education, good wages, good jobs, but rather that we need to define ourselves by literally, as Martin Luther King said, the color of our skin. It was Martin Luther King who said, I have a dream of a day when people will, my kids will be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin.
Yeah.
And so that, it's this kind of this push for identity politics is exactly against the spirit of doing that. And that's why MLK, in the end of his days, right before he was assassinated, was working on bringing poor people together from every race and gender and creed, because that's what scares the oligarchy in the United States, is when you start seeing beyond their kind of isolating silos in which they try to categorize, atomize, and isolate people so that they don't have conversations, they don't realize their common interests, and they don't organize to overthrow the oligarchy. And that's breaking down now, and it's about time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suspect that was one of the reasons that Fred Hampton was murdered by the Chicago police and the FBI.
Absolutely.
He was making very, very similar calls to bring, poor black and white people together to fight, the real enemy, which is, not your neighbor. It's the bloody oligarchs. It's the corporate elites, as it were. Nick, that's been great. Thanks for taking the time to come on the show this evening. Where can people follow you on social media?
Of course, you can find us at peoplesparty.org, and you can also find me at on Twitter, Nick_Brana, and People's Party _US. And you can follow us, you can support us. We'd love your support.
Great stuff. Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Nick. Appreciate you coming on the show this evening. I hope everybody has enjoyed the discussion. Nick's a great advocate for working class and for anti-war campaigners in the States. And as I say, he was, teamed up with us in the UK, and it was great to have him in London speaking to the No to NATO rally on the 25th of February at Bolivar Hall. We'll be back next week, hopefully at the same time, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. So until then, have a good evening, and we'll see you then. Good night.